Welcome, everybody. I'm Allison Brown. I'm president of League of Women Voters Falls Church. And today we're very excited to have a presentation about how City of Falls Church handles its budgeting process. And our deputy city manager, Cindy Mester, is going to present to us this evening. So welcome to Cindy. And we also have a panel, a panel of experts in our audience. So thank you so much for the great participation. I want to welcome Councilmember Phil Duncan, as well as City Manager Wyatt Shields, our Chief Financial Officer, Kiran Bawa. So we really appreciate you all coming to share your expertise, and we're very much looking forward to learning and discussing with you this evening. I will turn it over to Cindy Mester, our Deputy City Manager.
Thank you, Allison, and I really appreciate this opportunity. As we were planning for it, I definitely can say that this is something that gets us excited. We love community engagement, and we love to talk about budget this time of the year. So I am going to turn. My apologies for that. Timing is everything. So I'm going to go through the presentation and try to cover the materials that I talked about in advance that you all thought would be helpful. This PowerPoint, as well as some additional resources I've already shared, as you know, and I appreciate that you'll be putting it on your website so others can look at it in more detail. The intent today is mostly about the process. What is a budget? What is a capital? And how can you be involved? Not deep dive into the content of those materials, because that would take a couple more hours. And we will be actually starting that with our FY23 budget development process, which I will provide the dates and the opportunities how to be engaged. So I'm hoping this Budget 101 gets you teed up to be very actively involved in the FY23 budget development. We really do see this as how we build community. And the success of that is capital, civic capital. And I just heard that term about civic capital. We hear social capital. Civic capital is how we can engage together to build community. It's not just city staff. It's not just the elected officials. It's all of us. The elected officials represent you as citizens, our businesses, our visitors. And so, like I said, this is about how to be involved. And I'll touch on the process, the content, but not do the deep dive in that tonight. And let me get my slides to advance. So I want to cover sort of where does it all begin? What are revenue sources? What is an operating budget and how is that different than the CIP or the capital improvements program? What are some of the implementation tools we deliver? And then end with sort of the budget timeline and the community's role in that. And then look forward to comments and questions and dialogue. And that's where we'll have the opportunity to benefit from Wyatt and Karen joining us tonight. So where does it all begin and why? It is with the city's vision, Falls Church 2040. And I have the vision here, so you have it as a resource. I've also included the web link on this slide. And that is throughout the presentation, you'll find several web links. So there'll be resources for everybody to go to after the presentation. But this really is the true north. This is what feeds and builds our community. And the budget is the tool that implements this vision. So council several years ago had a retreat, really had some community engagement, got feedback, and then came down to what is that short sentence that we can say on an elevator ride that means to the city what we want to be in 2040. And it's always good to truth test it, and I think we do that through every budget process. But you can see key things like being a special place, leader, an education environment, multimodal, vibrant economic development, but then also still keeping our roots, that small town character and history. So when we start the budget discussion, you always start with your true north. That's the vision. It's built into the comprehensive plan. It's actually adopted as in the chapter. And along with the vision are core values. So how do you start to implement that vision? And so around that are these 8 core principles these values, and that's what we build our operating budget on. That's what we build the CIP. You'll see it in a lot of the execution, and it takes those things like environmental sustainability. Well, it was in the vision. So what does that mean? What does education mean? And so forth. So that all feeds into the budget. And within that, we're also very focused now on equity and environmental impact. And so I wanted to share these two tools that we're using. We've used it in the budget. We've used it in the legislative program, for example, used it in the CIP that I presented to Planning Commission last night. So we try to look at all of our programs, policies, capital infrastructure programs we're doing with these kind of lens in front of us. So we're affirming accessibility and safety and equality inclusion. We're making sure that what we do is sustainable and resilient and has a positive impact. And one of the things I noted under environmental impact is actually created a very interesting dialogue this year with the CIP. We were talking about synthetic turf and needing to replace the ones we have and keep them on a regular infrastructure. And there's a lot of physical and mental health benefits from that, especially coming out of COVID and the issues we've experienced. Allows us to use our fields much longer. You don't irrigate, you don't mow a lot, but you still have to maintain it. And it's synthetic, so it does have an impact on the environment. So what's the balance? And once you've completed that analysis, you think, okay, it's still on the plus side, let's pursue it. So that's just an example of how we use the lens most recently. The comprehensive plan, in addition to the vision that you see for chapter 1, has several other sections and very important chapters. So I've highlighted the ones that have recently had a lot of community engagement and updates. And every couple of years, these are refreshed as well as additional chapters are done. There's also planning opportunity areas, POAs, that target certain areas of the city and get more granular and focused. Right now, the Eastern Gateway Seven Corners one is underway. So that's an example. And then we build all of the budget around financial policies adopted by council and budget guidance. The financial policies and the budget guidance are two examples of the full document I provided to Allison and Barbara to put on the website. So you can do a deeper dive. I'm just going to reference them here tonight. All of that then rolls into council's work plan. That's what helps prioritize a lot of the big transformative efforts. It's built consistent to the vision. And this is just an excerpt, a screenshot of part of it, but you can see that small town character is right there. That's one of those core values. And as you go through the work plan, it's organized against that. And every 2 years, council will sit down, and they just had their most recent retreat on February 22nd, and now we're working to update the work plan. And these are really core things, because if it's a high activity for the next 2 years, then you're going to see it in the budget, because you need those implementation tools. So that's also on the website and the budget page. So when you take all of that sort of planning and vision stuff, how do we get from that why to the what and the how? This is just one graphic that we use in the capital planning, and you'll see it's transportation that I used here, but it can apply to a lot of things that we do in the city, whether it's capital or service delivery. But you're looking at the comprehensive plan, those small area plans, planning opportunity areas. We have a lot of master plans around bus stops and WNOD and walkability. That planning, the why, feeds into some of the priorities that often come out of that work plan. And then in the case of transportation, you'll see we do a lot of grant applications in order to fund these projects. So it'll help inform the grant, the scoping, it goes into the CIP. And then when we get the funding, then you get to go in those important things of engineering and construction. And the most exciting part, of course, is the ribbon cutting. But it repeats. And so you'll see this theme throughout my presentation tonight. This is an ongoing process, because you want to adopt consistent to the vision, the budget, implement, start the process, test to make sure we're still on track. So what are the other questions we talked about in terms of budget 101 is, what are the city revenue sources? So you'll see I've pulled out information from the FY22 budget that's already adopted. Karen and Wyatt already prepared these slides for presentations last year. You will start seeing these exact same things for FY23 as we start that budget process. But this gives you a really good sense of where the revenue sources are coming from. Like I said, not going to do a deep dive tonight, just the overview. But I can guarantee you'll get the deep dive from Karen as we go through the budget process. As you can see, the large part of that pie is real estate, and that's your property taxes. And so that's a really important piece because that impacts you all directly. This is the residential piece for FY22. It was 41%, commercial 17%. That helps inform a policy decision that ties back to that vision of economic development and inclusion, because we're doing economic development to increase the real estate commercial part of that pie, reduces the pressure and the burden on the residential. Then you can see personal property, vehicles, and machine and equipment, sales, meals. Some of these, of course, have been impacted during the COVID period. Business, property, licenses and fees. That's some of our grants. Rex and Park would be the fees for charges for services. So that gives you a sense of what the revenues are. And this is another way to look at it. Once again, FY22, and you can see the ones that really are a local impact for the city, real estate making up the largest amount. And you can see every year there's going to be some changes. COVID actually shows some reductions, for example. Of course, this doesn't have FY20, which started to change. So this is a really important part because the revenues, as you'll see, is what funds the operating budget and the actual service delivery. So this will be an important part of the budget deliberations. In the fall every year, we've already had a preliminary revenue projection that Karen gives and White gives to council and the school board to sort of say what's it looking like for FY23. That's part of it's a year-round cycle. Now, as we look at that, we need to make sure we're also, as we're doing services and capital projects, operating capital, we need to make sure that we're financially sustainable. So council, as I noted earlier, has adopted financial policies, and those speak to how much we need to have in fund balance, sort of that in the bank protection for the unexpected catastrophes. You know, we talk about our personal budgets. You need at least 2 months worth of expenditures in the bank. Is sort of that same kind of concept here for our fund balance. And so you can see between 22 to 28 what's been in our fund balance. And then the red line shows the adopted policy that you want to be there or above. We do the same thing as we issued debt, and debt is what we, the mortgage, the bond financing for our big capital infrastructure projects. Examples would be the City Hall renovation, the recent library renovation expansion, of course, the new high school, Meridian High School. So the blue down here is the kind of overlaps with the red in the beginning, and then it drops up below. That's our existing debt. With the proposed CIP, those will be in the out years, the new that we're adding. This nice teal is sort of the policy that you want to be at or below. The lower you are, that means the more capacity you have to do what the community needs and identifies. Up here, we have the maximum policy, and that's an important policy when we look at big things like the $120 million high school. And you can see we have good capacity. And when you see a drop like that, that's usually means a project that was funded several years ago has been paid off and coming off the books. Mary Ellen Henderson Middle School would be an example of that. So we obviously, I showed in the pie chart that property and real estate taxes are the largest part of that pie. That's the local money, as it were. But we also do work hard to bring other resources in. And so I wanted to flag grant resources for you all. And one of this came from a question that I know Sarah and you and Alice and you all sent to me about the school's funding. So I built that into this response. Federal grants, of course, right now is a a pretty significant thing we're looking at. We're seeing out of the federal government a lot of talk about infrastructure money, which is important for our bridges, our roads, our multimodal transit, WMATA. But there's also federal money for emergency management that we look for. And right now, in particular, we're really working with ARPA and the acronym of SLURF, which sounds really interesting. It makes me think of blue turf. Anyway, but ARPA is the American Rescue Plan Act for state, local fiscal recovery funds. And for short, we call it ARPA. And it is federal money that's coming to the relief for public health and economic impact from COVID. For the City of Falls Church, we have been allocated $18 million. There are a lot of restrictions with this, but a lot of benefits and opportunities for our community. And you'll see in a moment with the CIP, we're actually looking to deploy a lot of that into our capital programming. It gives us long-term benefit for the city's infrastructure. We do a lot of state grants and federal pass-through grants, and these can be around the transportation, library, police, smaller amounts. Transportation's the big. In the school area, the General Assembly right now is looking to hopefully do some more for grants and loans, low interest loans for school construction. On the operating side, they've always funded schools, but for the City of Falls Church, our portion that we get from the state is very low. And that is because of the local composite index. This was a specific question that came in to make sure that I addressed the LCI, the local composite index. This is a very antiquated state formula that has not been updated in a long time. And it's the way in which the state determined to give the most money to the most needy. And so they use the real estate values, the household income, the number of students. And when you do that calculation, every locality is assigned a composite index. For the City of Falls Church and most of Northern Virginia, you're looking at 0.8 out of 1.0. That 0.8 means basically that for every $100 we send to Richmond, we get 20 cents back because we have such a high index, we don't have the need for that other 80 cents. So for $1 goes to Richmond, 20 cents comes back. And some of the core equity issues there have value, but it's not been updated and it doesn't have enough factors that really balance out because as we know, we also have a high cost of living in order to provide good quality schools and teacher pressure, salaries. They have a state cap on how much support goes to non-teacher positions. And so there's just a lot of complexities in there. It is, however, a portion of the school's funding. When you look at their budget, which the school board has recently adopted, you'll see that the state and federal share is very low. The local tax dollar, the local transfers, we call it, funds the school predominantly. There's also regional grants, and these are predominantly in the transportation world for Transportation Planning Board, Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, Northern Virginia Transportation Authority. They're very competitive. But we've been very successful in bringing a lot of good dollars to the city. An example right now would be the undergrounding and sidewalk and work that we'll be doing around West Falls redevelopment, the area where the old high school was, or on Park Avenue, we have a grant that will be able to underground, widen streets, really improve walkability. This is a graphic that we just like to provide as a visualization on how much we are leveraging grants with our local dollars. And this happens to be focused on transportation where a lot of the funding is. This whole left side is money we can apply for, doesn't require a match. Nice deal. On the other side, there is a match requirement, but as you can see, we can really leverage the local dollar. So we spend a lot of time pursuing grants, but also with them being targeted towards the vision, the comp plan, those area plans. So they have policy behind them, and then we have to balance it to make sure we can deliver on them. So that's sort of the why. What were revenues? Now let's talk a little bit about the operating budget. And this really is the day-to-day expenditures, what the city needs to spend daily for service delivery, maintenance, internal operations. Revenues and expenditures have to be balanced. Unlike the federal government, the City of Falls Church does need to have a balanced budget. So that's a lot of the work that Karen and Wyatt are doing at this time, looking at what revenues are going to come in and what the needs are. I wanted to make sure that we covered what was the fiscal year, because you'll see FY a lot. And for the City of Falls Church, it's July 1 to June 30th. That's the same for the state, but the feds operate on an October 1 to September 30th. So sometimes people will hear fiscal year and not know. I also wanted to highlight that we call the fiscal year for the year in which it ends. So FY22 ends this June 30th, 2022. So I put those examples there for people because the federal government calls it the year it starts. So it can be confusing to folks. So right now, good timing for this session this evening because we are right starting the FY23 planning process. So you're right in time to have that civic capital and be engaged in the process. This is just a list of the services or the departments for which the operating budget covers. So these are the departments, but this is where you're going to have your snow removal, your leaf pickup, the potholes. We're going to have building permits and economic development and site plans and so forth. Police, sheriff, courts, everything that a citizen or a business would interface with the city on the day-to-day is coming out of the operating. Once again, I'll just flag the link is here so you can get to the adopted FY22 budget if you want to see it in more detail as we start the FY23. And here's sort of a snapshot that Karen provided last year for the FY22 budget in the broad categories of the operating budget. And you can see the school transfer. As a large part of our budget is the part that partners with our school system. And then general government, we have a commitment for affordable housing. We do get permit reserves, so we use that as a funding source. And then this is the debt. While in the capital, we're going to issue debt to do the projects, you got to pay that monthly mortgage payment as it were, and that comes out of the operating budget. And so each year, we'll assess the revenues against the needs and operating budget, and then you can see there will be changes depending on the situation. So that's presented to the community. And this slide just gives you a sense of sort of what we've looked like in terms of operating expenditures against revenue growth. When council does their budget guidance every year, one of the things they look at is how much can the operating budget grow? And a lot of times we'll look at the base of organic growth separate from that new commercial economic development. That will help inform it, but we want to see sort of what the baseline is. And this just gives a sense for what's in the general government side and the school transfer side. So we are one city, but there's two big functions within it, right? The general government and the schools. So this is just another piece of the puzzle when we're developing the operating budget. Then transferring in or transitioning into capital improvements program, the CIP. Allison, you were talking about acronyms when you were first getting involved in budget process in town halls. So CIP is one of those, and that is our capital. So you have the operating budgets at the day-to-day. This is going to be our big investments into the community that have a longer life. This is a sample of some of the ones we've done recently or have planned. So you've got parks, you've got traffic signals, you've got HVAC needs at the community center, and this represents faulting for stormwater to help mitigate urban and inland flooding in our community. So the CIP, we do a 6-year adopted plan, and we always have an additional 4 years so we can do a full 10-year look ahead. And that's going to be your capital infrastructure needs. And then we also identify the funding sources. And a lot of times that's debt, as I mentioned. PAYGO would be the local tax and grants. A CIP is defined as a project cost that's more than $150,000 and has a useful life I see I dropped 5 years in my typo. So a useful life of 5 years, but it's 10 years if we issue debt as a minimum. It's updated annually, but even when we do the update, we're still looking at that 6 and 10-year window. And we do need to make sure it's financially sustainable and have that balance of staff to deliver the projects. And so that's where a lot of times we try to leverage grants and lessen debt. And the ARPA funding is actually helping with that a lot. We have 7.4 of that 18 million, for example, invested into stormwater. And we have a state pending grant for an additional 4 million of the state's ARPA money for stormwater. All of that money means less debt, less burden on the taxpayers. And this is a link again straight to the CIP. The other link was to the operating budget. We've had a lot of great progress. And as I was telling the Planning Commission last time, I presented the CIP. We're really proud of the ability to still deliver big capital projects, small capital projects, community needs during COVID. Challenging with staffing, certainly challenging with the cost escalation that we're seeing now on material and supplies. But there's a new high school, a beautiful new library. Big Chimneys Park is constantly full of kids, and we've done some important walkability, sidewalk improvements under the neighborhood traffic calming. And this South Maple one, a little hard to read on the screen, but we're really excited. It's our first pilot project of embedding into the concrete history, telling the history of the city. This one is for the Tinner Hill and 5 of the women that are honored in the Women's History March each year. We also have a lot of ongoing projects, and this document's on the website and in the CIP. So once again, it's just a snapshot because I'm not doing a deep dive on all the projects, but we have 28 active projects. 2 of those were just recently completed, so I still counted them as active as we reported out. We color code these so we know if they're on schedule, on time, and on budget. That's green, sort of the traffic signal. Green is go. 7 is on yellow, a little caution. That's usually where we're having some delays, either because of review times with VDOT or staffing or budget, but they're still going. And I was really pleased this time we had no red, which means we've had to stop something because of something major. Now, this is a lot of information on the slides, and it's once again something I'm not going to go through detail, but I wanted to make sure you all had the awareness of these resources that'll be on the P drive. Not the P drive, that's internal for the city. How about the city's website? So this is the big picture of the CIP. It is $118 million of investment over a 6-year period for general fund, schools, transportation, stormwater, and sewer. This is where you may not know about the operating budget because you don't know something behind the scenes for IT protecting your credit card when you register at Rexon Park for a program, but you're going to see a capital infrastructure out in the community, right? You're going to see that high school or an intersection improvement. And it's a big dollar amount. So this is one I wanted to highlight for everybody to help increase your awareness of what's out there. This one here, the summary just shows you some of the variety of funding that we go for, and certainly grants are a big part of that to reduce the burden on local tax dollar. Also in the CIP, you'll see all the projects listed by the specific funds. This is general funds, so you'll see public safety, information technology, facilities. That includes general government and schools. And then recreation parks, and that could be fields, the synthetic turf, Fellows property, which is currently going through the community engagement process for what do we want that to look and feel like. And that's the property the city bought that's across from Oak Street Elementary. So all of these, you'll get a sense of what the project is, how much it costs, what's the funding source. And in the CIP is another document that will fully describe each project, so you can definitely drill down. So we have that for the general fund, also for the transportation fund. And you can see $66 million worth of grants out there. That's pretty significant when you think of the full CIP is $118 million. And we have a lot of local money contributed to WMATA. That actually helps us bring down and make us eligible for additional grants. So what's important on this slide is how much we're leveraging local dollars and bringing in grants. Similarly, we have fund and projects for the utilities. The top part is sewer. These are those invisible infrastructures that you don't necessarily see, but you know it when there's a problem. So we have very old infrastructure, given how long the city has been built out. And so we've been over the last few years really having an investment into our infrastructure. And as you've heard, a lot of community engagement and discussion on around stormwater because of the flooding. And so there are, after the Stormwater Task Force met, the 6 big projects have been identified, and that's been incorporated into the CIP. And that's where, fortunately, we're bringing in federal money to help pay for those. So the utilities in total, we're investing 43 million back in. This is a quick snapshot for you of where all the funding of the CIP is going by projects. This is all funds, which means it includes the utilities. So over here you see the utility part of the pie, and then each of the individual ones. This purple is the biggest and always is our biggest in transportation. And that, if you think about council's vision, you think about the chapter on mobility for all modes in the comprehensive plan, and you look at the work plan, you're going to see walkability, you're going to see accessibility, you're going to see bikeability, sidewalks, safe crosswalks. That's a really important piece. And so the CIP is matching that priority, those vision, that value. So moving into sort of the big last question, what is the budget timeline and what is the community's role? And that is you, because you all equal the civic capital. This is a situation where council's adopted the vision of policy statements as your elected governing body, but they do that with your input and your direction for which they were elected to be your democratic leader. But it only works if we continue to have your engagement, your input. So this really is all of us in it. As I mentioned earlier, it's a year-round budget cycle. We are in stakeholder input, and then we get into the developing and the needs assessment. We get the guidance to staff, that's budget guidance. We start developing the budget, get it adopted, then you implement and monitor, you adjust as needed. Sometimes you'll see on council's agenda a budget amendment ordinance because something's changed. Usually not as big as COVID, that did cause some budget adjustments, but sometimes it's just a new grant or a new priority, stakeholder input. It is a continuous process for improvement. As a budget schedule goes, as I mentioned last night, so that should be the second, not the third, I presented the CIP to the Planning Commission. That presentation, video, and the full CIP will be posted on the website by the end of this week. So available for anybody who wants to do a deep dive. March 16th, they're going to have a public hearing, and that's when they'll make their recommendation to council for what to include in the CIP or not. And so there's a good opportunity for members of the league to be actively engaged right now in that process. Then on the 28th, the city manager will present the budget to city council. When he presents the budget, it will be the operating budget that we described earlier for FY23. And it'll be the CIP, which will be FY23 to 28, because that's the 6-year focus, but we'll also have the additional 4 years there for visibility. Then there'll be 2 town halls coming up, and you can see the dates there. And I just want to highlight, one will be at noon for the middle of the day for those that works best for them, and then also an evening one. Currently, the budget is scheduled to be adopted May 2nd. And then with my CIP hat on when I was working with the Planning Commission last night, then I circle back with them in June and fall to continue that CIP cycle. So the presentation includes some additional websites, the main CIP and the main budget website for you, and then contact information for me. And I'm glad to answer the questions directly or get you to the right staff person. I also included this map resource in here so that the community, whoever looks at this website later, this presentation, you can see where we have all of the CIP projects mapped. It's kind of interactive. You can go to an area or a geographic area or a transportation functional area, for example, and see what's planned. We also have one that's targeted to the neighborhood traffic calming program. And so hopefully I've covered all these questions that we started out earlier. Where does it begin? What are the revenues, operating budget, CIP, and then ending with the timeline and the community's role as we do that build that civic capital for our community building. And with that, Allison, thank you for the opportunity. Glad to answer any questions. And as we noted earlier, Wyatt and Karen are here to help me with any questions as well. And questions are always welcome later.
Thank you so much for all this great information. I'll kick off with a question, and hopefully other audience members will have questions as well. We're a small enough group. Feel free to unmute if you have a question and say your question. I'll also monitor the chat. So would you say a little more about how City Council and the city staff interacts with the schools on budget? I understand that City Council gives the superintendent budget guidance every year. How does City Council come up with that guidance? And what happens if the superintendent does not come in with a budget within that guidance? What are some of the possibilities there in terms of how that school budget feeds into the rest of the budget?
That's a great question. Certainly a big part of the whole process. Wyatt, would you like to kick that one off?
Good evening. This is Wyatt Shields, and it's a great question. The City Council and the school board have a great track record, I think, of trying to share information and coordinate things effectively, and that's not always it's not always the case across Virginia. If you look at examples of where that relationship sometimes can be rather fraught. But so the way we try to handle it is in November or early December, we meet together, school board and city council together. Karen Bawa, our chief financial officer, presents our best look ahead at what the revenue picture will be. And we then discuss kind of what our big issues are in the coming year, both the schools and the general government. We share notes. We have this, what we call right now, the spirit of an agreement. We don't have a written agreement, but we have kind of a handshake agreement that we take the basic ratio of how local government dollars, local tax dollars are currently split between general government and schools. And it's about, Karen can give us the accurate number, but it's something like 56, 44 or something like that, with the slight majority of local tax dollars going to the schools. And so our handshake agreement is that going forward, then in the subsequent fiscal year, that split, regardless of how the revenues shake out, we would work within that so that a tax increase is not required. And so that's basically how it's been handled. Last year, we had a tax rate reduction. And so that really came about because revenues came in ahead of what we thought they would in March. And so both the schools and the general government held within the expenditure constraints that we more or less agreed to in November. And the extra revenue then was given back to the taxpayers in the form of a tax rate reduction. So that's a quick overview of how that works. Happy to answer any additional questions on it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece, Allison, because obviously you saw the schools is a large part of our service delivery, and having that sort of virtual revenue sharing allows that discussion to unfold. Now, when you go through the town halls and the budget work sessions, often the schools do participate. The superintendent or the school board chair will be there to be able to answer questions and show the ballots. Many on this call probably know, but I'll just confirm that the school board has already done their deliberation on the budget. So the superintendent developed his proposed budget, just like the city manager will shortly present. It was presented, a lot of community engagement, town halls, decisions presented to the school board work. The school board has now adopted their budget, and that has been transmitted to Wyatt and Karen, because that will also be folded into the operating budget when it's presented on March 28th, because those revenues expenditures also need to take those expenditures into consideration.
Oh. And we have a question in the chat, which is, can you talk a little bit about the financial growth expected with Broad Street developments, and how will you plan to allocate that extra revenue?
Excellent question on the value and benefit of economic development. Karen or Wyatt, can I ask you to pick that baton up first?
Well, maybe I'll give a crack at it, and then Karen can jump in, Cindy as well, or Phil Duncan, others. Economic development has actually been a very important part of the city's financial sustainability over the past couple of years. And so when you look back to the recession, I'll answer the question directly, but I'll just provide a little bit additional background. So if you were kind of think back to the recession years of 2009 through 2013, roughly, and then our kind of emergence from that big, the Great Recession. For most of those years, the economic development, the way it functioned was it helped mitigate otherwise what would have been reductions in revenue. And so that growth is what kind of helped us fund the schools without major tax increases, and general government as well. So looking ahead to like Founders Row is got their certificates of occupancy this year. They're not fully leased up, so they're not at their full assessed value as of January 1, but it will be an increase over last year. I don't yet have that number. Kieran doesn't yet have that number either, because the assessor is still finishing up his work. We have a brand new assessor of real estate, and we're I think he's going to do a great job, but we'll get those numbers soon. And what we anticipate is that Founders Row will produce additional revenue for the budget. And last year, I think that in terms of the council's ability to give a tax rate reduction, that was in part due to some of the economic development that has occurred in the city. One other thing I'll say about this, kind of the biggest economic development project that we have in the city right now is the West Falls project, which will occur on the former high school site. And we have modeled the revenues from that project as covering the debt service for the new high school. And so we are actually kind of, that we need that development to happen to meet our financial plan for the financing of the high school. And of course, it's been tense as we've gone through COVID to keep that project on track. It's been a pretty difficult environment for commercial real estate, hotels and retail and office in particular. Those are real cornerstones of what we're trying to accomplish there, at the high school site. And so it's been difficult, but I think we still are on track, and the development team, Falls Church Gateway Partners, is planning to break ground in April, and that's very positive for the city's fiscal picture, since we have taken on so much debt for the brand new Meridian High School, which is wonderful and a great asset for the community, but also was quite a significant financial challenge that Kiran Bawa helped guide us through.
And I wonder if we could check, the chat question talked about Broad Street development, and I'm not sure if that was referring to Founders Row or maybe the new Inside or the One City under consideration. So I don't know if Carla wanted to expand upon that or make sure we answered her question at least. Kavita, sorry, it was small on my screen.
Yeah, you've answered my question. That was actually very helpful. Sorry, I'm on mute because there's a lot of background noise in my house.
engagement in the home front too.
One of the things that you showed in the slides about the fiscal year 22 budget was that 4% of the funds came from the fund balance. And I'm wondering whether that was unusual, or why the city decided in fiscal year 22 to use that reserve fund. If you could say a little more about that.
So that
Sure.
that ties back directly to what I was speaking of. Part of our plan of finance has been to use fund balance that we've grown up to help defray the debt service for the high school, and kind of what we call shave the peak of the highest years of debt service. But maybe Ms. Bawa could jump in and explain that in a bit more detail if that'd be helpful, Alice.
Sure. Hi, Kieran from Finance in the city. So the idea was to build up the reserve so that it's a smooth impact to the residents, and we don't go through a peak like where we raise and reduce the real estate tax rate. So we kind of came up with a uniform tax rate, so to have a smoothing effect, so that we are not seeing a lot of peaks, just like Mr. Shields said, to shave off the peak and build our reserve in the first few years, and then in the next consecutive few years we're going to draw it down. And that was the intent when the model was made in 2018, 19 at that point.
Yeah, essentially that was the plan of finance that Kieran Bawa helped us develop, and that we actually took to the voters for the bond referendum for the high school. And so we're now executing that plan really quite, very much along the lines that Ms. Bawa sort of forecast out for us. Some things that, will be positive in the future after when we talk about shaving the peak. Mary Ellen Henderson, as Cindy Mester mentioned, that comes off of our debt service in 2026. And so that's, one positive thing that helps us cover the Meridian High School debt service. But two, the economic development will start paying taxes, out in 2026, 27, like 3 years from now, 3 to 4 years from now. And so we've tried to use our reserves to try to bridge that gap to, one, Mary Ellen Henderson coming off of her books, and two, the annual taxes that will be paid to the city by the 10-acre development where the old high school used to stand.
And you explained what the CIP was, but then on one of the slides, it says school CIP, and it has a 125,000 figure or something. So will you explain that? Why is there a separate CIP line item for the school, and what does that reflect?
Yeah, so the CIP, when we're developing the programs and all, we do jointly, but there is sort of the funding and the accounting side of it. So Karen, do you want to speak to why we had a line item separate there?
Yeah, sure. So when we are developing our budgets, there are the two pieces, the operating and the capital. The operating, of course, is, and both the city and the schools develop both sides of both these budgets. So we get a request from them on their operations, X% increase or whatever their needs are going to be for the following year. And they present that to us by mid-January, and their board adopts by mid-February. In addition to that, they also have a request for any facilities upgrades that need to happen to the schools, sometimes new roof and replacements and other flooring and other things that need to happen. So they come back to us with a request as part of that budget of CIP request for the following, looking at a 10-year, but closely more at the 6-year, and then expand it over to the 10-year window. So they provide us those numbers as well. The 125,000 that we have from them for this year is for fiscal year 23, and then the CIP itself has a 6-year view, and there are other figures for the following years with a description on what specific needs those are going to be for. And we try to fund such kind of requests even on the city side, the general government side, with the pay-as-you-go money. And in years where we do not have such funding because these are more maintenance kind of things that cannot be debt used. We can't use general obligation bond funding for those. So the idea is if we have the right kind of money that we can, then we try to, of course, fund these as we go along, or any year-end one-time money that is left that can be used for such capital needs. So.
And one thing I'll add, Allison, is that the school can't issue debt. And so all of the CIP funding sources and debt are on the general government side. So we jointly work the projects, but when we have to account for it, that debt's going to be on the city side. So there's a separate line item also often, so it's much more transparent. What's the transfer for operating and what's, yes, it's school debt like Mary Ellen or Meridian, or when we did some renovation at Mount Daniel, but it's going to be on the general government side of the ledger. But I probably said that very layman's term, Karen, so make sure I said it accurately.
You explained it well. Thank you.
A lot of people don't realize that it's, the school's debt's on general government side.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, actually with the high school expenditure, I was a little surprised that the schools didn't have more than 4.8% of the CIP. Just, kind of as a layperson, it seems like, with the high school expenditure of over 100 million, I would have guessed it would have.
One of the ways, that's actually a great question, because this is the FY 23 to 28, so it's going forward. And of course, the high school is already fully funded, so it's not showing here. Now, if you looked at the pie chart when we were funding the high school, it would look different. And I think that's an important piece why also we do a fair amount of discussion on what are active projects. Because when you look at just the next CIP is going forward, but yet we're working a whole lot of stuff that's already been approved and in process. And so it's two sides of the coin, right? We're talking budget 101 for planning the FY 23, but by the way, we're still working. So yes, you're right. The pie looked different when we were funding the high school.
Cindy, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the budget town hall and what that is going to be like, because I was thinking that that's something that probably a lot of our members might be interested in attending, and I just want to be sure to be able to provide them information about that.
Certainly, and we do have this on the website as well. These are great opportunities where, and you'll see they're following the formal presentation to council. So Wyatt and Karen will do a sort of a scaled down presentation to give the facts on the revenues, the operating, any increases, those type of things, and just present that out. And then we look forward to questions and dialogue. And if I'm correct, Karen and Wyatt, these are still going to be virtual, right?
Yes, that's the plan.
Yeah, so there'll be a team link and people can, join us, and we'll raise hands and have questions. And it's just a great opportunity actually to have similar conversations like we're having tonight, but it'll be on the FY 23 budget. So it'd be great if you could help us message that out, Barbara.
Absolutely. I will be sure to let our members know about that.
And also the March 16th Planning Commission meeting, that's a public hearing. And so the commissioners will be receiving input and thoughts on the CIP specifically, because that's what's been issued by our charter. They have to review it and make a recommendation to the city manager that then goes to council. So the CIP is being worked a little ahead of that March 28th, so that we have the Planning Commission's recommendation to roll into Wyatt's budget. And of course, we have the school board's recommendation now, and that'll roll in. So that public hearing is also another opportunity for your members.
Great. I will be sure to put the word out on that.
That'd be super. I should mention also, I can't remember if I put it on. Oh, I did, and I forgot to mention it. This year, we're going to do something similar we started last year. We're going to have videos done by each of our department directors for all those functional areas I mentioned, and be about 3 minutes. And so it'll be a quick snippet on what do they do and what's in the budget and what are some of the new initiatives. So that'll be a nice way for people just to really get oriented. And we're going to do a budget overview video. That'll be about 5 minutes. It'll be another sort of synopsis of what you would hear at the town hall, but available for people anytime. And then do one for the CIP. We started that last year and it seemed to be well received, and it's a good way to get the basic facts. And then like when council's deliberating over a specific request, they already have a good foundation, and it's a great resource for the community.
Okay, great.
Now we
Does
can
anybody have a
actually-
final question? Well, probably have time for one more question. Okay, well, if there's no final question, thank you so much. We really appreciated all this great information and the presentation. So thank you so much, Cindy, for doing such an amazing job presenting to us. And thank you also to Wyatt Shields and Kiran Bawa and City Council Member Phil Duncan for joining us today, and for all the work that you're doing to make the budget happen and the city run smoothly.
Yeah, it was totally outstanding, and we will definitely be sharing it with all of our members.
That's great, because we need to build that civic capital, and you all are part of that.